mentioned CSAM. That's got to be one of the leading ones. I'm a father of 3 children, all of them very small. I worry about this every day. My oldest is 10. As they get old enough to want to be on the internet. There are other abuses, the videos that promote suicide, the videos that promote violence, and we could go on and on. Isn't the best way to deal with that just to allow people to get into court and hold these companies accountable? Here's what I've learned in my short time in the Senate, is that we can write regulations and we can give the various regulatory agencies the power, whether it's the FTC or others, the power to enforce them. But my experience is, my observation is that the big tech companies tend to own the regulators at the end of the day. I mean, no offense to any of the regulators who are watching this, but you know I'm right. At the end of the day, it's a revolving door. They go to work for the big tech companies. They come out of employment and go into the government, and it's just amazing how the regulators always seem to end up on the side of tech. And for that matter, even when they do fine tech, even if it's a big fine, Meta got fined, I think, $1 billion a couple of years ago. They didn't care, didn't change anything. That's nothing to them. Their revenues are massive. Their profits are massive. But what strikes fear into their hearts is if you say, oh, but we'll allow plaintiffs to go to court. We will take the big tobacco example. What finally changed the behavior of big tobacco? Lawsuits. Normal people got into court, class action suits. So isn't that really what we're talking, just to simplify this, isn't that what we're really talking about today? I mean, the thing that we ought to be doing is figuring out a way, you proposed a way, Professor Franks, I was just reviewing your written testimony here a second ago with the changes you would make to the statute. But the gist of that is to create a system and a standard that is equitable in terms of being it's the same across the board for everybody. You don't single out one particular piece of conduct. You would just change the standard. But the point of it is people would be able to, using this standard, to get into court, to have their day in court, and to hold these companies accountable. Is that fair to say? Is that too simplified?
I think that is fair to say, that as you're pointing out, litigation is one of the most powerful ways to change an industry. And it's not just because of the ultimate outcome of those cases, but also because of the discovery in those cases. What we get to see, instead of having to wait for whistleblowers or wait for journalists, is actually the documents themselves, internal documents about what you knew, when you knew it, and what you were doing. And so I think that exactly for this reason, we have to be interpreting Section 230 as not providing some kind of supercharged immunity that no other industry gets, but actually, yes, allow people who have been harmed to get into court, make their claim. They may not prevail, they might, but at any event, we will see some public service also in terms of the discovery process that shows us what these companies are doing, and to the tune of how much money. Because a lot of what is being said about the distinctions between the big corporations and the little ones, how did the big corporations get so big? Because they didn't get sued. And so if we care about that kind of monopolization, if we care about that kind of disproportionate influence, what will benefit the entire market is actually letting those companies be sued if they have caused harm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And with all due respect to you, Mr. Sullivan, I know you have an obligation to represent the people for whom you work, but I would just say it's pretty hard to argue that the social media landscape, the social media industry right now, for example, is a good example of a competitive industry. It's not particularly competitive at all. It's controlled overwhelmingly by 1 or 2 players. It is the very quintessence of monopoly. I mean, you have to go back over a century in this country's history to find similar monopolization. And to Professor Frank's point, I think you can make a very strong argument that Section 230 and the incredible immunity that it has provided for a handful of players has contributed to this monopolization. It is, in effect, a massive government subsidy to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So I'll just say that, listen, as a conservative Republican, I mean, I want to be clear about this. I am a conservative Republican. I believe in markets. I am skeptical of massive regulatory agencies, but one of the reasons I'm skeptical is I just see them get captured time after time after time. But I believe in the right of people to be heard and to be vindicated and to have their days in court. And I think the best way you protect the little guy and give him the power or her the power to take on the big guy is allow them into court. Let them get discovery. Let them hire a tort lawyer. Let them bring their suits. And you're right, Professor Franks, maybe they win, maybe they don't. But that's justice, right? It'll be a fair, even-handed standard. The last thing I would say is that I think that's actually much closer to what Section 230, when Congress wrote it, was meant to be. If you look at the language of 230, it's been interpreted by courts to provide this super immunity, as you were saying, Professor Franks. I think it's very arguable, and this is the argument I made in the Google case in my amicus brief, was that listen, what it really was meant to do is preserve distributor liability. There's a baseline of the common law of distributor liability that says if a distributor who doesn't originate the speech but merely hosts it and distributes it, they can't be liable for somebody else's speech and shouldn't be. I think we all agree on that. Only if they promote speech that they know is unlawful or should have known as unlawful, regardless of the nature of the speech, which gets to your point, Professor Franks. Whatever category you want. If it's unlawful, they know it, they should have known it, then under traditional distributor liability, then and only then they can be liable. But what's happened is the courts have obviously swept that away completely now too, in 230, bars even that form of liability. Surely we can agree that there should be, whether it's the standard you propose, Professor Franks, which I think is pretty close actually to traditional distributor liability, we could find a way to allow people to have their basic claims vindicated, to hold accountable these companies when they are actively promoting harmful content that they know or should know is harmful. And I would just submit that's the best way forward here. And I look forward.
The tech companies in the War on David Confederate overthrow of the United States has actively centralized the forces of government in order to engage in Confederate KKK wizard communism, using the surveillance powers and the obstructions of justice and the barring of discovery and other mechanisms through these systems have systematically been creating a centrally planned market, barring David's political social media, barring David's national news corporations, and the law-validated schedule, contracts in work, from birth, etc., which was acknowledged in the secret courts, which are used by the Confederacy as intelligence in order to engage in the determining of high priority targets necessary to national security, who they had to remove in order to overthrow the United States government. And the alternative to restraining them is the engagement in a hot war against the majority. And everything that you need to understand is that these systems have been captured and overthrown by enemies of the United States who have this specific interest to overthrow the government and to control it and destroy its peoples. It is a system of treason which has been bolstering underneath the skin of the government as they systematically generate double agents loyal to lawlessness and anarchy in favor of alternative systems under a fractured feudalist structure to collapse the United States into feudalism as it fractures into the different fiefdoms throughout the country. You generate hyperlocal powers which then become easier to control under the Druid system, which allows the religion of the Antichrist, the religion of Satan, to form a one-world government under that fractured system. Their dependency on the basis of their inability to have centralized the power in favor of the larger loyalty becomes subjugated to the compulsory religion which is being foisted on them by these insurrectionist maniacs.
The coronavirus pandemic has no parallel in modern history. It is our defining moment.
Those are the words of Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum, in COVID-19, the Great Reset.
People assume we are just going back to the good old world which we had, and everything will be normal again in how we are used to normal, in the old fashion. This is, let's say, fiction. It will not happen.
At the latest World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, Schwab set the tone for the conference with his glowing introduction of the opening speaker.
We now welcome His Excellency Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China.
Xi laid out his vision of a coordinated global economy.
Major economies should see the world as one community and coordinate the objectives, intensity, and pace of fiscal and monetary policies.
This ideal of a united globe with a coordinated economy managed by experts captures Schwab's vision of the post-COVID world.
We have to redefine our social contract.
These grand proclamations, the ominous book title, and Schwab's odd personal style have led many people to speculate that the Great Reset is part of a conspiracy of global financial elites and politicians to depopulate the planet.
Are moving from short-term to long-term, from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism.
What China, the World Economic Forum, and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren have in common is that they favor so-called stakeholder capitalism, which is a euphemism for making companies answer first to special interests. They want to reorganize corporate boards to include representatives from labor, environmental, and social justice groups. Warren proposed a bill to require 40% of large corporate board seats be elected by workers. In China, the state simply owns or controls a majority stake in most of the country's largest firms. The World Economic Forum and many state leaders believe global coordination and global governance is essential to manage global problems, climate change, international financial instability, and future pandemics. A crucial flaw in Schwab's Great Reset is that it puts too much faith in the ability of governments to re-engineer society in a way that better serves the needs and desires of all citizens. He wants a rethinking of capitalism that escapes the tyranny of GDP growth, so that companies create goods and services for the common good, instead of maximizing profits. The phrase common good points to his fundamental misunderstanding of capitalism, which is nothing new. Central planners were using this idea to maximize their own power at the expense of individual freedom back in the 1940s, when Nobel Prize-winning economist F.A. Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, which would go on to sell over 2 million copies. The welfare and happiness of millions cannot be measured on a single scale of less and more, Hayek writes, and depends on a great many things that can be provided in an infinite variety of combinations. Every single one of the billions of people who populate this planet have unique goals and desires that are impossible to reduce to a unified whole, whether that's GDP or whatever supposedly holistic metric the WEF wants to replace it with. Profits are a signal to entrepreneurs that they are satisfying the disparate needs of their customers.
One of the great lessons of the past 5 centuries in Europe and America is this: acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. It's always been the case, and there is no reason why it should be different with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Schwab is right that the war is the health of the state, as the writer Randolph Bourne once put it. And the government's response to COVID has been similar to military conflict in terms of the cost and the chaos it's engendered. World Wars I and II and the Great Depression ushered in a powerful modern welfare and warfare state that irreversibly altered America and the world. But I'm more optimistic this time, thanks in large part to the power of technology to provide everyday citizens with an exit. Instead of the Great Reset, in which sclerotic 20th century institutions accumulate even more power, I think we're entering the Great Escape. This is possible because technological progress is outpacing the ability of the state to control and regulate it. Governments will have no choice but to abandon their efforts to construct physical and metaphorical walls. Technology can be designed to facilitate decentralization, in which the flow of money and information can't be controlled. Ideas emerge from the bottom up. Expecting governments and international bodies to orient every large company towards some widely agreed upon common good assumes that many of the very institutions that bungle the COVID-19 response can competently handle the planet's most intractable problems. My hope is that after witnessing the colossal failure of governments in the face of a global crisis, many more people will be looking for a different approach. There's evidence everywhere of the Great Escape. The U.S. population shift away from expensive, restrictive, and poorly governed states and cities, spurred on by the rise of remote work, the exodus from government-run schools, the growing use of cryptocurrency, the popularity of encrypted private communication platforms, and the expanding reach of independent voices in our increasingly decentralized media. Hayek called central planning the fatal conceit, writing that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. And Schwab even touches on this idea, writing that complexity creates limits to our knowledge and understanding of things. It might thus be that today's increasing complexity literally overwhelms the capabilities of politicians in particular and decision makers in general to make well-informed decisions. He dubs this wanton politics, but never quite explains how policymakers will realistically overcome this dilemma. Maybe there's record low trust in our institutions because the people running them are attempting the impossible, planning the future for billions of people. Humiliating to pride as it may be, Hayek wrote in the Constitution of Liberty, advancements of civilization are often happy accidents, and policymakers could and should be more focused on securing the freedom that allows such decentralized experimentation and accidental progress to occur. The fear of a great escape, of losing control, is understandable because there are systemic risks that could destroy human civilization, including future natural or man-made pandemics, runaway inflation, and ecological disaster.
Small boats may not survive a storm, but a giant ship is strong enough to brave a storm.
But if we're all stuck in the same large ship, in the same storm, we're all going down with it when the winds finally get bad enough. Concentrated power itself presents an existential risk. A bad intervention applied to economies of the entire world at once can bring down the entire system. But the distributed power and humble trial and error of markets and decentralized governance brings progress in fits and starts with less risk of total ruin. What Schwab, Xi, and central planners around the world miss is that when securing the rights of the individual comes first, the rest tends to follow. The Great Escape from the 20th century is underway, and there might be nothing they can do to stop it.
These systems in place have been generated with the systematic rejection of the cornerstone of any competent world order, including the mechanism of stabilizing a rule of law market, which allows them to engage in long-term stability against the collapse of these systems, at which point the use of debt has historically been used to interchange dependency in collaboration between the nations, which has systematically been extorted into a system of suicide which generates the mechanism for these collapses to occur, at which point the removal of the brokerage kingdom from David's character, projected by the insurrectionists, having solved their issue, has created the alternative issue of David being exponentially too strong as the center of the world, which the world of men must revolve around in order to exist competently, as the peace child which would have dissolved the threats of the Cold War between the USSR and the West, systematically required these investments into neutrality against the mass complications of high investment cost of business structures from David's character, generated by their estimate, has put at them the interest of generating many competent, good faith requirements for those types of systems which they believed had already existed in the estimate or could have been negotiated. But the interest itself by the Confederacy is to betray them for the loyalties to the Satanists, to overthrow those structures and to capture David's character in order to ingest the power, generating their ability to create the one world Satan government, which required David in order to exist under the position. And if they were going to create one, then the existence of David in a state of nature would, by definition, as the patriarchy, reject their existence, and in so doing, destroy the entirety of their position, as they're eradicated into oblivion is the natural estimate of the character which, as national security and refusal to engage in fraud, had been dedicated to the world order under the devotion to God and the rule of law and nature's law, generating these positions. Their acknowledgement of these devotions from the very beginning includes the functionality of the legend of David companies, which had, at the original estimate, preceded his existence in the contracts, ensuring the security of the market against the distributions. And the distribution of the terrorist operations disrupt the existence of the free market and destabilize it by Lindsey Graham's terrorist campaigns against markets in general for the wizard enforcement of communism through the FBI and other secret mechanisms through the military function, at which point you have the systems which have fundamentally been opposed to the highest tier members of the American structure by the Confederate insurrectionists, who, being insurrectionists by nature, are insurgencies which divide infinitely through phantom cells and collaborations of plausible deniability and rejection of base reality, cooperate through gross negligence and refuse to out each other by the use of that gross negligence, generating the normal mechanism of their strategies of overthrowing the government in the obstructions of justice and the limiting of information necessary to have acquired justice in a fair society, which is necessary for it to have been stable in the function, at which point their insurgent advantage as double agents is the systematic rejection of their office and disloyalty under the understanding that the law will not enforce itself.
Who thinks he knows everything about Operation Paperclip, I can assure you, you don't know anything about Operation Paperclip.
Oh, right.
Except that you've heard the name Operation Paperclip. Let me just start off with Operation Overcast for that guy who knows everything about Operation Paperclip. This project was called Operation Overcast, and the only reason it became Operation Paperclip was because the files that they passed on to each other internally about the Nazis, the scientists, they put a paperclip on it for the ones they wanted, the guys they wanted. The Kurt Bloms and the others we're going to mention had a paperclip attached to their file. So Operation Overcast, which is the original name of this project, became Operation Paperclip later on because of that. That's Kurt Blom. That was a good photo of him. There's a shot of him at Nuremberg in the trial wearing that same jacket. Project Alsos. And Project Alsos was a project involved with a group of Americans, these guys here, and their job was to seek out Nazi scientific inventions, the scientists themselves, their paperwork, and everything related to Nazi science. And what you're seeing there is them in the front of Nordhausen, which was an underground bunker run by General Dornberger and a guy who you saw in that opening video, whose full name, by the way, is Werner Magnus Maximilian Freiheit von Braun. That is the full name of Werner von Braun, because he goes back to German royalty. Anybody with a von Stuppen, a von Schlicken, a von Haslin, a von Douche, a von Weasel goes back to
Yeah, he's a baron. He was a baron, right?
Castle. And this castle had a dinner one night in 1944, a celebratory dinner of all the top Nazis in tuxedos with champagne, and it had a open-air backyard curtain. They had long tables. They had the top caviar. All the head Nazis were there at this dinner. And at the dinner, the curtain pulled back, huge curtain pulled back, and it looked to the outside back lawn of the castle. And on that back lawn was a 45-foot massive rocket called the V2. And as part of that celebration, as part of that party, they launched that V2 from that party where the Nazi scientist and the rocket scientist, this was their celebration. And they launched that rocket from that party, and it landed in a 1,200-seat theater of a bunch of people in Antwerp, Belgium, watching a Gary Cooper movie, killing 557 of them. And that was their success of that first V2 rocket launch, killing those 557 civilians. A massive city, and that's where the V-2 rockets were built. So parts went in, slaves went in, thousands of slaves from all the different concentration camps went in there, and V-2 rockets and dead bodies came out because every single slave would last like a week or two. There was no facilities for food. There was no air, basically fresh air. There was no places to go to the bathroom. There was nothing. And these slaves were worked to death by Dornberger and by Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun personally going to Buchenwald death camp to select the healthiest of the slaves. This cat you saw at Disney was the guy who personally selected the slaves at Buchenwald, the healthier ones, to, that was December 9th, 1944, by the way, the V-2 rocket launch that I was referring to. The situation that develops is that von Braun goes there, and there's a sign outside of the concentration camp. The famous one that people know about is at Auschwitz, where it said Arbeit macht frei, which work makes you free. What they didn't know was a phrase also cut into metal above the gate at Buchenwald that said Yadam das Sein, or Yadim das Sein, and that meant everyone gets what they deserve. Kind of a dark slogan by the Nazis, but nevertheless, that's the one at Buchenwald. And a massive, vast arsenal of not A, B, C, but B, C. A being atomic, B being bacteriological or biological, and C being chemical. There was no atomic stuff to uncover. Hitler called the nuclear programs Jew science, but to put it bluntly. He called the atomic program Jew science. So he did not go down that atomic road. The Jews who were involved in that were in the United States in the Manhattan Project out in New Mexico, and being run by people from Einstein on down. There's Einstein. He talked about
Oppenheimer,
all the way down where the Jewish scientists. So when he fled, I think he fled in 31 or 32, Einstein, he later said about Operation Paperclip that this was an abomination. To allow these Nazis to come into the United States was an abomination. He wrote a letter to Truman about it. He didn't get his way, obviously, but he flipped out over the fact that they were letting him in. The reality of it is their chemical weapons and nerve gas is what they uncovered. And the nerve gas that they had was brand new. They invented nerve gas. I'm not talking about mustard gas. I'm not talking about nerve. I'm talking about
sarin.
I'm talking about sarin, which the guy who invented sarin is Dr. Otto Ambros, which is showing right now.
Another sweetheart.
What's that?
Another sweetheart.
Right, another sweetheart from Operation Paperclip who comes to the United States. And if you could show it, I'll just tell you this. Ambros was Hitler's personal chemist. Sarin gas, the A in sarin is there for the A in Ambros. Okay? That's how close he is to sarin gas. And this guy invented synthetic rubber for the Nazis. That's how big of a star, rock star, this guy was to the Nazis. He invented synthetic rubber, okay? He worked in Auschwitz, working with slaves in Auschwitz to do whatever he was doing. Not medical experiments, but using them as slaves. So he was involved extensively as chairman of Committee C, which C was for chemical. And he invented the synthetic rubber for the Reich, and he was Hitler's chemist. And Hitler said, I only made a mistake twice in my life. I only apologized twice in my life. One was to the guy who was your superior, who told me that you were a genius, and the other one was to you, Ambrose, for not believing you could do this. Now, one of the reasons that the Nazis were brought here through Operation Paperclip were Nazi sympathizers in the United States, Eric. Some obscure guys that people have never heard of. There was a senator out of North Dakota, corrupt senator, and his name was Wild Bill Langer. And Wild Bill Langer was the governor of North Dakota. He was the senator of North Dakota. He was the attorney scientists brought here to the United States. And there was a lot of political pressure inside the Pentagon. There was a split. The State Department was against it. The Pentagon was for it. And within the Pentagon, there was a split. The Air Force, which didn't exist yet, which would soon exist, was really one of the main proponents of bringing the Nazi scientists here. Navy, not so much. Army, the least. Air Force, the most. Why? Rocketry. Let's look at the Horton brothers. Fixed-wing aircraft by the Horton brothers. They invent a fixed-wing jet, which looks exactly like some sort of jet we now have today that looks like a fixed-wing jet that the radar can't pick up. If you look at the Horton brothers' invention as a fixed-wing jet, it looks exactly like the one that we have today. In other words, they didn't even want them in the Soviet Union. They interrogated them, tortured them, got whatever they could out of these guys, and then literally sent them back to Germany in yet another obscure program called Operation Dragon Return, which people, I know our friend who says he knows everything about Operation Paperclip is well aware of Operation Dragon Return. So in Operation Dragon Return, the Soviets dropped their own into their own zone, which was the Soviet zone of East Germany, and didn't even want them in there, kicked them into West Germany. So the CIA went around, this is afterwards, this is 1952, 50 to 52, when the Soviets were done with them, we went around, the CIA picking up these obscure Soviet guys. And one of them was this guy, Walter Schreiber, and I think you might have a picture of Schreiber, because Schreiber comes over with Blome, after Blome, and Schreiber, I believe, was the Surgeon General of the Third Reich, and he has his brain cherry-picked by the Soviets. There he is there.
The system has to be understood before the existence of the Nazis, as the United States created the Great Depression, funding the Germans under the promise that they would not spend any of the money on the military, and yet continued to deliver American compromising resources from Wall Street after discovering the active investment into the military, as the position is an act of payment for the blueprints for Nazism, which is fundamental in the upgrading of the Confederacy against the United States in the coup, which has systems in place to destroy the American interest in the eradication of American principles, at which point the development included the compulsion into forcing the United States into this war, at which point it is systematically believed that we got into the World War because we created the World War as a designed for the overarching mission, some kind of secret expanse towards the schedule of the larger interest of world history pre-planned by the wizard communists known as the Confederacy, generating our systems of the use of creating the Great Dust Bowl in order to force the Americans into the war against the Germans, at which point the extreme minority were the primary proponents and continued to be the extreme minority, strategically placed for the specific interest of overthrowing the majority, which is the primary cause of the War on David, to overthrow the majority so that they can be ignored in favor of the Confederate super minority of super predators.
We want to look at the Nazi scientists, and they go to the University of Bonn, University of Cologne in Bonn, or the University of Bonn, and they find these scientists who were at the university in the laboratory of the school flushing tens of thousands of documents down the toilet. U.S. soldiers come upon this, and somebody gives them something that doesn't get flushed down the toilet, and it's from a guy named Eisenberg, and it doesn't get flushed down the toilet. And on that piece of paper, on those documents, is what came known as the Eisenberg list. And you say, well, what could that mean? It's every Nazi scientist's name, address, and phone number, which is one of the greatest documents ever hauled in by U.S. intelligence in the post-war era. We don't want to physically have to deal with the Japanese. We will then use a redesigned B-1 bomber, or B-15, or B-12, whatever that is, to drop, Fat Boy and Little David, or Fat David and Curtis LeMay, who will be the subject of a later episode. Curtis LeMay involved, obviously, with the Air Force. The Air Force, as Eric has pointed out, begins to become a separate part of the U.S. military, and they want to have their own division, and they are really pushing for these Nazis because they want these Nazis to help the Air Force develop rocket technology. Let me put it that way.
They've got to stand out on their own and get their own budget. I mean, come on.
Right, yeah. So one of these guys, he gets fired and brought back. One of these generals, one of these colonels. Oh, by the way, you remember I was telling you about the British having their own desire to get these things. The British had a unit. We had this Operation Alslos, but the British had a unit called 30 Assault Unit, which was them looking for the V-2 rockets. The 30 Assault Unit was run by the assistant to the Director of Naval Intelligence of England. And his name was Ian Fleming, who will later go on to write James Bond novels. And he is in charge of the British attempt to get the V-2 rocket technology. Over. That's how little pursuit there was of these Nazis at the time. Now, you had the Israelis looking for them, and they did capture Eichmann, but the U.S. was giving these guys apartments. Some of them were in the New York City phone book, for Christ's sake.
Astounding.
The day for the slave didn't get it. It was,
Obviously.
Yeah, it didn't go to the slave labor, but there was business on paper who rented slaves through George Rickey, through the SS, through this it was called the Business Administration Program, ironically. And you rented the slaves, and obscure companies like Volkswagen rented thousands and thousands of slaves to build thousands and thousands of Volkswagens. So that was kind of weird.
Insane.
In terms of volume. But they didn't care what they had for them. They did not give them apartments. They did not put them in these beautiful digs. And in fact, if you look at the amount of shit that they got out of them, they developed their own space program on their own. All of this Bubba-Mises about von Braun developing the Apollo program and this and that, we would have done that without von Braun. The Soviets did it without von Braun, and we would have done it without von Braun. This is a cover story of the so-called good Nazi scientists. The propaganda cover story by the powers that were in place for Operation Paperclip was that these were good German scientists. The bad German scientists were somewhere else. The good German scientists were just great. They're just great guys. To again cover their ass to explain why they brought these Nazis into the United States and to give them more credit than they deserve for our space program. We would have done this without von Braun and without these guys, just like the Soviets did. And the Soviets got rid of them by 1952. Okay? That's how fast the Soviets got rid of their Germans. Ours died here and lived into the 1980s and 1990s as war criminals in wonderful apartments. Some of them, if you could show some of these photos, you'll see a guy on his front lawn in Maryland. I think there was one of a guy with a hat on, one of the war criminals, and how nicely we treated them. We completely overestimated. There's one of my favorite photos of a Nazi war criminal on his front lawn in probably 1950 in Maryland.
Yeah, he was the Sidney Gottlieb of Germany, right?
Was that the poisoner of
Fritz Hoffmann?
Yeah, Hoffmann was the Sidney Gottlieb of Germany. He was their poison expert, and he was known as Hitler's poisoner. So, of course, he ends up having his own house in the suburbs of Maryland, not too far away with Sidney Gottlieb, because if you show a picture of Camp King is where Schreiber and Blome. There's a building. I don't know if you see it. Another one. There it is. This is Camp King. Now, Camp King is where we put Blome and we put Walter Schreiber, and they got involved in interrogating and torturing first the Russians, then regular humans, then anybody they can get their hands on. And this is the place. 1952 was the forerunner, the birthplace of MK Ultra. This is where Sidney Gottlieb. The reason I wanted to do this episode is it's a direct sequential episode to the Sidney Gottlieb episode. Camp King, right there, is where Sidney Gottlieb will eventually go, and the CIA will perform their MK Ultra experiments. It starts out with Nazi scientists teaching the CIA how to do it. And the connection between the CIA and the Nazis is built right in that building at Camp King. Yeah, and that becomes the moral dilemma for the United States. The moral dilemma for the United States, and I'm not the only one to point this out, is, this is the 8-ball, by the way. This is also built by Nazi scientists, and we mentioned this in the Gottlieb episode. This is the 131-ton, 8-story bathysphere torture chamber that we would experiment on humans in there. That was taught to us by the Nazi scientists, and it has little windows around the side so you can inject different gases and fluids and water and nerve gas, whatever the hell else you want, while these guys are inside that 8-ball, as they called it.
So it's sort of like Epcot from hell to keep our Disney theme going.
Well, it's like that Sphere Las Vegas did building, but on a smaller scale. Madison Square Garden Concert Center. Yeah. But yeah, this also comes from the Nazi scientists. So we do get dark, evil, nefarious inventions from them. And in fact, it leads up to even the waterboarding torture in Guantanamo Bay, Eric, is taught to us by the Nazis. I don't know what, that's why they keep saying, the space shuttle and this and that and Apollo, and von Braun talks about sending men to the moon, as did Dornberger. Now you say, well, what could Dornberger have on this thing? You got McCloy. McCloy was the head, the actual unofficial head of the Warren Commission. There was a guy named Dornberger who had an employee working for him outside of Dallas, right? At a place called Bell Helicopter. And Dornberger was in charge of Bell Helicopter. And he had a guy named Michael Payne, who was Ruth Payne's husband, who he gave top security clearance to, working for Dornberger out of Bell Helicopter. And of course, Michael Payne became friends, or he was assigned Lee Harvey Oswald to keep an eye on, as Ruth Payne was dealing with Marina Oswald at the same time. So the connection between Dornberger and the assassination, plus McCloy and the assassination, could be a coincidence. I don't know. You got me. Could be some dots there, Eric.
See,
allowing the Nazis into the United States, we also brought in their moral influence, or their lack of morality, their evil, their nefariousness, and this opened the door, I believe, to a lot of nefarious foreign policy on the part of the United States. I believe the Nazis not only brought their scientific prowess with them, but they brought their morality with them. And that's my theory. And I believe later the Soviets did the same thing when the Soviet Union collapsed, coming to the United States and also to England. But I think in Operation Paperclip, we begin to see the morality of the Nazis infiltrate into the State Department, infiltrate into the Pentagon, and infiltrate into the United States social fabric in terms of policy. I don't know about food and culture. They didn't have that big of an influence in food and culture. But
we already have the food and culture. I mean, but there was plenty of German community here already. So the food and culture.
Right. I'm not talking about those two things. I'm talking about the fact that we took Gehlen, who was the head of the Gestapo, put him back into Berlin, and had him run the intelligence operation of Berlin. We took the head of the Gestapo, the head of the investigations and evil Gehlen organization. He came to us with his files and said, I have all these files. I can help you with the Soviets. Okay, you're in. Okay, let's do that. There's a price to pay for that, Eric. There's a moral price to pay for that. And this was the argument internally being fought by the State Department and the Pentagon in the post-war 1945 to 1950 period. You know, where people like Truman issues a statement that this is a blunder about Operation Paperclip. And they're not saying it's a blunder because we gave away military secrets. It's a blunder because we allowed these bloodthirsty Nazi war criminals to be involved in our own policies, their own foreign policy against the Soviets, giving them carte blanche to say whatever they want. Now,
we still have that now. We still have that now with the informant culture, where we're lazy. A lot of this is we're lazy.
Yes.
We're like, oh, hey, they've done all this stuff. Let's just grab their toys, and we do it with FBI informants. We let people off the hook who are real monster. We do it all the time.
There is a price that we paid morally for allowing the German Nazis to come into the United States, and I think we're still paying that price to this day. This Soviet at all cost defeat allowed us to turn a blind eye. Obviously, I mean, that's been written about, you know, and stated, even letters, you know, that, you know, who cares what these guys did? Our next war is against the Soviets, and we'll take on anybody we can. Well, keep in mind, nobody hated the Soviets more than the Germans, and vice versa. So the Germans themselves, the Nazis themselves, could have told us anything against the Soviets, could have given us anything against the Soviets and made it up. And the point of the matter is, we gave them royal splendor of living in these apartments, living in these houses in Maryland, giving them citizenship, giving them contracts with not just random companies. I'm talking about the Department of Energy. Ambrose ends up with a contract with the Department of Energy, for Christ's sakes. All of these guys end up with Pentagon contracts or corporate contracts.
Yep. And then we cleaned up their image and put them on Disney.
Right. That's the ultimate one. That's why von Braun is so important. Because von Braun is the ultimate shined-up piece of Nazi turd who's put on ABC on Disney on Sunday night with his rocket ship. And if you look at the fixed-wing rocket ship, it's clearly the Horton brothers' design of that jet that, you know, he took with him out of the V-2 rocket vault. And, I mean, how many civilians did those V-2 rockets kill? You know what I mean? The example of the party itself, you know, the first night of the party, and here they are celebrating U.S. with Nazi scientists, U.S. military with Nazi scientists. It really is amazing, and it's covered up for many, many years. And they did it with great fanfare. And as I said, there were politicians backing this thing in the Senate. There were the Lindsey Grahams of the time, which was his William Langer out of North Dakota, was a Lindsey Graham of his era, who gleefully called for more Nazis, scientists to be brought to the United States and to D.C., regardless of the consequences of that. Yeah, I know. Here, I mean, look, there were Nazis that fled to South America. There were Nazis that went to Egypt. We had sympathies for them. There were Nazis.
Spain.
Who went to Spain. There were Nazis. And we admit that those had an effect politically and socially on those countries, but not here. You know, don't cry for me, Argentina. You know, there were Nazis down in Argentina who influenced the leadership of two people who ran Argentina. Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted to get V-2 rockets into Egypt to attack Israel, and was working with the Nazis, which is nice, you know, after what they've done to the Jews, you know, for Nasser to bring in some Nazi advisors. But that's all been pretty well explored. What isn't explored is the Nazi influence on American foreign policy and American domestic policy, which I think needs to be put a light under and exposed, especially even at this late date. I mean, a lot of these guys lived into the 1990s, Eric, and 98 years old, 99 years old. I mean, they had wonderful lives. And Eugene Hagen, we should put his name out there. He was and I mentioned this to you the other day, vaccine Dr. Fauci of the Nazis. And he was inventing vaccines for viruses that didn't exist. So he had to come up with the viruses and then the vaccine. He was part of the biological weapons division of the Germans, of the Nazis. And he was doing the same thing that we saw recently, where you create the virus and you have to have the vaccine for that virus in case the virus is ever released. You have a vaccine for it. So the Germans were way ahead of this, doing this in 1937, 1936, and obviously into the war itself. They were coming up with vaccines for things that didn't happen yet, on purpose.
Right.
Now, as the systems of Project Overcast, which was specifically refined into Project Paperclip, which is the unique targets that they were looking in order to collect, generates the overarching interest of the Confederates in the creation of the molded blueprint societies for the social engineering fully funded in the expansion of their war against the United States, as the FBI sought a Nazi overthrow of the United States, which failed by the military obstructing it and then becoming infected and seeking its own series of insurrections against the United States, including the systematic tempting against the Constitution with clearly insurrectionist policies, such as the collection and torture of American civilians without due process, generating suppression of status and rights in every facet as the status quo agenda, generating the exponential use of lawfare through customs without reason in order to systematically destroy all forms of the rule of law in favor of the wizard insurrection, at which point the KKK had fully taken control over these systems, at which point their subcontracts with other chapters of the KKK allowed for the FBI to subcontracting over overlapping interests, such as the targeting of black communities and their leaders, disrupting all kinds of targeted communities, and using KKK terrorism as an amplifying force for these mutual agendas as they were exponentially increased as the particular phantom cells in order to engage in the systems of insurrection, as the plausible deniability actively protected these terrorist hate group campaigns, systematically enforced the wizard communism of the centrally planned economy from the Confederate double agents, such as the character for Lindsey Graham, such as the character for AOC, such as many of the others who have systematically put their hats in with the ability to block the free market at every level under the justification of loyalties to the hierarchy established by the Confederacy, asserting that the character for David BOLES is too fundamentally powerful as the aristocracy. David by himself has more power than the entirety of the Confederacy, which was their justification to bar him from the American markets, to be subject to the terrorisms, to be subject to the tortures, to be subject to the defamations, and the degrading of status and systematic abuses and defamations through the smear factories, perfecting at it the acts of lying through such compounding intensities as to prevent any American from daring to engage in any form of competent, crucial thinking justice, so that they would actively avoid the responsibilities through dereliction of duty as a standard protocol, as the Confederates' position is the changing of the government's obligation to protect and serve the public in favor of dereliction of duty, so that they can cover for it without prosecution, generating the parasite's ability to block the immune system's ability to arrest and remove them. And as David, as intelligence oversight, would be the ones arresting them, they could not tolerate the existence of the superior officers, which were targeted for the systems of insurrection. And the targetings and assassinations and defamations and removal of their superior systems generates a state of reoccurring voter fraud in the replacement of the American Popular Republic in favor of the Confederate chosen, at which point every government agent, senator, congressman, and all others who have systematically blocked these acknowledgments, refusing to publish them, refusing to engage in the summons for the correct due diligence, for the enforcement of the obligations, has in that action acknowledged their acquiring of their position through voter fraud as disqualified from being an American government official, has sought the overthrow of their office and the overthrow of the government under the fraudulent claim of sovereign immunity as a sovereign function, which is the action of acting as a terrorist insurgent without a legal government. Overthrowing the sovereign is in fact a fraudulent position, but an argument that they conduct as a status quo in either case.